In the early 50s, tourists to the Manitowish Waters area were becoming more interested in activities geared toward families. The Poiron family from California came to Manitowish Waters and purchased property from Jim Bart of Rest Lake Resort. There had been riding stables on the property, and thus began the story of the Flying P Stables. In this interview, Darla Poiron talks about growing up at the Flying P. This interview was conducted September 5th, 2017 by Manitowish Waters Historical Society members Janelle Cole and Kay Kranz.
My name is Darla Poiron, and my parents were Jean, or Eugene, and Leela Poiron. And
Leela.
Lela. And back in 1950 or 51, I don't recall the year, I was pretty young then, we were traveling across country and they stopped to visit some people they knew from California who were from Medford. And the brother of the people that they knew in Medford talked my father into coming up and seeing his hunting and fishing country. My father fell in love with it, and they ended up purchasing property from Jim Bart. The first year we were up here, we lived in a one-room shack, actually. And I was young enough that I slept on a shelf above their bed. And we had enough room for a table, a double bed, and a wood stove. During that year, my father built another building, which is known as the Shed now, which was still one room, but it was a lot better built and watertight. But it's still one room, and I slept on a shelf, being probably 4 at the time. The next year, that year, I think the town fathers came and talked to my parents about running the stables. There had been a riding stables on the property before we bought it, and because there was such a lack of things for family to do other than fishing up here at the time, the town fathers, as my mother explained to me, that...
Did you ever hear any names? Was it Palmer? Or?
It would have had to have been Palmer.
Mm-hmm.
My mother said that the town felt that they needed more attractions for the area for families instead of just fishing. My mother was raised on a ranch in Texas, so she was familiar with horses. My father was raised on a flower farm in Pennsylvania. He knew nothing about horses. And so we bought some horses, and we were in the riding stables business. The first year before we moved into the one-room shack was spent actually living in the hangar at the airport. The hangar at the time, the only hangar at the airport at the time, was 2-story, and there was only a couple of planes that flew in and out of here. But my dad had spent most of his youth and working life working around airplanes, so he was very familiar with airplanes. And I can remember looking out the window in the evening, and the whole runway was just covered with deer. And there were no planes, but it was between the airport and Bart's pasture, which is now grown back up to trees. There were no other empty spaces, fields type of thing, where the deer could graze in the evening. Let's see, what else?
Tell a little bit about your parents were living in California at the time that they discovered
Right.
this place.
We
Tell
were
about that. Tell about
living in California.
Yeah, or even how'd your parents meet? Maybe go back there and how they end up in California if they're from
Okay.
Texas and Pennsylvania.
Well, my father was an adventurer, or he thought he was. And he completed 8th grade. That was as far as he went in school. And he decided he was going to go to Cuba. This had to be 1920s or 30s. I'm not sure when that was. But he was out of school, and it wasn't Teddy Roosevelt, the Spanish-American War. I don't know what civil war was going on down there at the time, but he was going to go to Cuba, and he thought he'd go in through Mexico. So he was riding his Indian motorcycle west, and as far as the motorcycle didn't make it past, I think it was Arkansas or Missouri, before it broke down. And he had enough money that he sold it for enough money that he got a bus ticket to San Diego, because he figured he could go into Mexico through San Diego, through Tijuana. So that's how my father got to San Diego. He got a job flying for Cons Airway at the time.
So you had already had a pilot license?
Yes. Oh, yes. My father, his first job was during the Depression, greasing airplanes' engines at Lindenhurst, New Jersey. That was where the Hindenburg went down. I have pictures of...
Lindenhurst?
I think it was either Lakehurst or Lindenhurst. I'm not sure which one. Could be Lakehurst. It's very well known. Just look up Hindenburg.
Okay.
And it will tell you where it was. When he was a boy, he and a friend of his flew in to LaGuardia on a biplane that they had, and it only had 2 wheels in what they call a tail dragger, which was a piece of metal in the tail. And they got chewed out by the airport manager because they had just poured concrete on LaGuardia on the runway, and the airport manager was afraid that the tail dragger was going to mess up his runway. So,
story.
Yeah, that was my dad.
Now, when you say Cons Airway, do you remember how
CONS.
CONS.
Uh-huh.
Cons Railway.
Airway. They flew freight out of the West Coast to the Pacific Islands. This is World War II. He only had sight in one eye due to a childhood accident. So they wouldn't take him in the draft.
But he was allowed to fly with one.
Yeah. They were a lot less strict then. He didn't fly after. Well, he didn't fly for Cons Airway. He was a navigator.
Navigator, okay. So they were probably helping though.
Yeah, they were in the war effort. They were flying supplies to the Pacific during the war.
Okay.
And at that point, my mother was from Texas, and she went off to school in San Antonio and got her beautician's license. And the war came along, and she found that she hated being a beautician. So she went to work at one of the... I forgot who she was working for, but it was at the airport where they were building...
In San Diego?
No, this is in San Antonio.
Okay.
They were building planes for the war effort. And she was... Now, my dad told me that she was the first licensed woman inspector in the country. I don't know if that's true or not.
Uh-huh.
But she liked being an inspector much better than she liked being a beautician. She was much more mechanically oriented.
Uh-huh.
And she used to hop flights when they delivered the planes from San Antonio to San Diego and that's how she met my dad, through mutual friends out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, this would be in the 1940s.
Yes, early 40s. Well, no, it had to be later because the war was on. We were already in the war.
Yeah. And so then they set up house in
San Diego. And they built an airport. In Spring Valley, called La Presa, which is now a housing development.
Valley, and the airport was called La Presa.
La Presa, 2 words, L-A
P-A-R-S.
P-R-E-S-A.
Okay. Okay.
Now, I was born in 47.
What's your birthday, Darla?
February 23rd.
February 23rd,
Mm-hmm.
1947. And how about Tony?
Tony was the first girl born in what is now the Howard Young
Oh, she was
Hospital.
born up here.
Yes. At the time, it was Dr. Kate's hospital. There was no hospital here in the area, and Dr. Kate had her penny parade, and she got contributions from all over the country in pennies.
Yeah, if I remember that.
And
So it's Tony T-O-N-I? Was that her-
T-O-N-I. It was short for Antoinette, which I preferred to rather than Tweety Pie, which was what my parents called her.
And what year was she born? Her birthday?
56, I believe.
Oh, quite a big difference.
Yeah, she's almost 8 years younger than I am.
1956. Do you remember what was her birthday?
August 16th.
All right. So we're thinking we came up here in the 50s and then
Right, early 50s, 51, 52, because I was still a toddler
Okay.
when we came up here, so it had to be, I would have been at least 3, but no more than 5.
Okay.
So I was trying to figure it out.
Yeah, plus 3 would have been 50. Plus 5 would have been 52.
Right, so it's 50, 51.
Yeah.
They had sold the airport out in San Diego at the time, and then they were taking a trip across the country to visit my dad's relatives in Pennsylvania, and for my mom to meet them.
Traveling to Penn
Mm-hmm.
to meet family. Okay. All right. So now if we go back, we were at the point where they bought horses. And
Yeah, we bought horses, and my cousins came up here. I had
Cousins
two
on your dad's side?
on my mom's side. 2 cousins from Texas,
What were their names?
Delmer and Olin
Delman
Bowman, D-E-L-M-A-R.
And
Olin, O-L-A-N, Jr. And their last names were Bowman.
B-O-W-M-A-N.
Right, they were my mother's nephews. They were 12 and 14. Got them out of Texas and gave them some spending money.
12 okay, Delman was 12.
No, Delmer was
14.
14 and Olin was 12.
12. And did they come to help with the ranch?
Yep,
Or
help with the
horse?
horses.
And they were horse people.
Well, not really, but they were. My grandfather had a ranch, so they were familiar with horses, but they were not horse people.
Okay.
Their dad had grown up on a ranch, so they knew a lot about it.
Uh-huh.
But they came up and they lived in the original shack.
Mm-hmm.
What else? There's
Do you remember how many horses they started out with?
probably 10. I don't really remember. I was pretty young.
So this is the property across 51.
Right.
And
And there
how
was,
many acres do you remember?
my dad told me once that we have 12 acres.
12 acres.
And we still have all of it except 100-foot lot on the lake.
Okay. All right. So What are your memories of
Well, I can remember traveling, when we traveled in the truck. It was, yeah, we drove a truck, a pickup.
but every summer from then on you
Every summer from then on, we came up here and ran the stables. We'd open by the 4th of July, sometime the middle of June, and we would close Labor Day.
from the mid-June to Labor Day.
Mm-hmm. When I was 10, my parents bought the Campbell's Resort on Highway W. And it was renamed the Flying P after our stables. Flying P Riding Academy and the Flying P Guest Ranch. And I was 10, so it must have been 57 when they bought it.
Okay. And that was not on water?
It was on the water.
It was on. I
Yes.
thought it was.
It's on the north side of Rest Lake, or it was Highway W. Before.
I thought so. Why do I keep thinking it was Red Feather?
No, it's across. Red Feather is different part of the lake.
Okay, so it is on Rest Lake.
Mm-hmm. You know where Papoose Creek?
Yep.
Okay, Papoose Creek ran in front, actually almost in front of our place. That's how far north we were.
Okay.
The Sella house was the view from our deck, our dock.
Okay.
It was something I just thought of, and I was going to say, oh, no, what was it? About the stables. My father was, one point in there, he ran the airport
Yeah.
for the town. And he was the airport manager. I can remember when a plane would fly in, and if he didn't have the car, he'd get on a horse and ride over to the airport to take care of the passengers and fueling the plane. And that was pretty interesting. I still, to this day, can see my father getting on a horse with a gas can. Riding over
And
to
riding
the
across the highway. That's pretty cool.
My father didn't know how to ride, really, because he'd never really ridden horses. He was raised in a suburb of Philadelphia. So that was pretty funny. But there's where he got his canoe. He loved to canoe. And we still have that canoe. I still have that
It's a
canoe.
wooden canoe?
No, it's not. It's one of the first Alumacrafts.
Oh.
And it's much better. Years later, my sister and I took a canoe trip up the Manitowish River. We both fought over who was going to use our canoe and who was going to use the rented canoe, because a rented canoe was a dog. And it was so hard to paddle, and our Alumacraft was just fabulous. I mean, it cut through the water. It was much better built than the newer canoes of the day in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, tell us about his airport manager. Is that why you lived in the hangar?
No, we lived in the hangar because that was the only place there was to stay, that we could find place to stay. Well, I think we were living there, or we stayed there when we first came up to buy the property from Bart.
Okay, so
And I don't think
stayed in the hangar.
We stayed in the hangar. We weren't there for very long. I mean, like a couple of weeks maybe at the most.
Okay.
But at home during the winters, I remember my dad always had somebody's airplane in the garage that he was rebuilding for them
in California.
in California.
So he was a real mechanic. I mean, he really knew how to put them.
And his preference were antiques, the fabric planes. My first job was working for first money making was for my dad, because I must have been about 12, and I was small enough to fit in the tail section of a Piper Cub, and I bucked rivets for him. That's probably why I'm a little hard of hearing now.
So when you say bucked rivets, what does that mean?
It means that he's got the rivet gun on the outside of the skins, and I had a metal bar on the inside, so that they would pound into that metal bar and form a seal.
Okay.
And they widened out, just like rivets in your belt,
Right.
or the same theory.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, how many years do you think he was the manager at the Manitowish Waters Airport?
It was only summers, and it would have been, maybe 3, 4.
Okay.
Because at that time, they'd built a cabin that had a bedroom and a bathroom. Yes, across where the stables are, and it was built on a cement slab. It wasn't winterized. It was only half log. The only heat we had was the fireplace, so we couldn't stay in during the winter. So we actually would go home, but I would start school up here.
Oh, that's neat. Well, tell us about that. Which schools did you go to?
Well, I only went to the 2-room school, Manitowish Waters grade school. And I started out in the little room, or the lower room, which was 1st through 4th grade. And then I moved to the upper room, which was 5th through 8th.
Did you do that every year?
Almost every year till, I think, 7th grade. I don't think I did it after 7th grade. But that was the big thing, is they would let me ride my horse to school one day. So I would have all the kids around me. I was really popular then because I had a horse.
Was that every year you rode your horse to school?
Yeah, one day.
One day every year. Mm-hmm. That's cool.
I can remember when I was, well, I had to be about 12, I guess, 10 or 12. I would ride my horse into town and tie her up at the telephone pole outside by the telephone booth and go in and get an ice cream cone. My one claim to fame was that I could lick an ice cream cone at a full gallop and not get it all over my face. Oh, yes. Tony DeLava used to get so mad at me if the horse would leave any fertilizer, because it was in the front of the soda grill. And I thought, what are you complaining about? It's free fertilizer for your flowers.
Right. So when you would go to start school, how long maybe?
Usually 2 or 3 weeks.
2 or 3 weeks.
Yes.
But that was kind of fun, I bet.
It was fun. It was. I've always remembered that Mrs. Ells was the teacher for the lower room. ELZ.
Oh, ELZ.
And
Teacher.
the only male teacher I remember, I think his name was Hodge.
Mr. Hodge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Buzz Moletsky could probably tell you. And I do have a phone number for Buzz if you need to get a hold of him.
He'd probably be a good one to.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Who else? Well, that was some of the things that we did.
How was school different here than going back to San Diego?
Well, you have 4 grades in one classroom.
Yeah.
So if you were in a younger or a lower grade, by the time you got to the upper grades or the grades ahead of you, you already knew half the stuff that you were supposed to learn because you'd heard it through the students ahead of you. So if you were in 1st grade and they were studying something in 2nd, 3rd, or 4th grade, and they were making reports on it in front of you learned it. So you actually learned a lot better because you had repetition and you had more attention, because
The older kids are paying attention to you as well as the teacher.
the teacher, yes, because, we had maybe 4 kids in each grade.
Mm-hmm.
So you figure 4 grades, that's only 16 kids or children. They're not goats, they're children. And, so that's about all there was. I have several school pictures. My cousin Delmer married Nancy Els, and they moved.
So he ended up being a Wisconsin person. Huh?
No.
No, he took her.
No, Art Els had the Standard Station in town.
Oh, so this is before Dietz.
Yes.
Standard Station.
Art sold it to Dietz.
Art Els.
And Art always wanted to go to Oregon. And after Nancy married Delmer and moved into having her own family, then Art and Ebba sold the gas station and moved to Grants Pass. And then Delmer and Nancy moved to Grants Pass. And Art passed
Grants Pass,
Oregon.
Okay.
It's between Medford and Portland.
Okay. So was Nancy was a lot older than you then?
Yeah.
Because Delmer was.
Delmer was a lot older than I
Yeah.
was. And Nancy had finished college. And so she ended up in Grants Pass as vice president in savings and loan. I don't know which one. Retired from there. And
So Nancy's mother was Mrs. Els,
Yes.
the teacher.
yes,
And what was her first name? Do you remember?
Ebba,
Ebba.
EBBA.
And then her daughter went on to get college educated and
Mhm.
savings and loan. Cool.
And my cousin, he and Art had a business together, another station, filling station. And then they sold that, and my cousin Delmer worked for 3M out in Portland. Ebba just died here maybe 4 or 5 years ago. She was in her 90s.
Wow. Do you remember where she moved here from?
Well, she had family over in Winchester. She had some sisters, I believe, or Milwaukee. They had, but I do know that they had relatives.
Winchester connection?
Yes. And I don't know what their names were. I remember where they lived, but I don't remember what their names were. I was much more interested in their Manx cats. I liked animals.
Yeah, I know you did. When I was growing up, the ski show was the center of our lives, and also the stables. As kids, we would go and ride, and I remember all those rides along the paths by Deer Park. Yeah, those wasn't it Deer Park?
No, it wasn't Deer Park. It was behind Little Bohemia along the channel.
Okay, behind Little Bohemia along the channel. Oh, those were pretty rides.
Yep.
In the woods.
That used to be state land. And the state traded that land for, I don't know what, but they sold a lot of that land on the channel. When I was growing up, it was all state land on the west side of the channel between Rest Lake and Stone Lake.
Did you lead the trail rides?
Yes. Oh, yes, I was leading trail rides by the time I was 5.
And do you remember the names of your horses?
Oh, I remember the names of almost every one of them.
Did you have was there a favorite that you recall?
Well, I had my own. I had Penny. Of course, if I wasn't riding them and we needed them, the customers got to ride them. But I always had my own. Penny was the first one. We used to buy our horses from the Medford Fox Farm, or Mink Farm, with the Killers. And
Their name was the Killers?
well, they're referred to, it's a slaughterhouse.
Oh,
Killers, the slaughterhouse.
the Medford Mink Farm.
Mink Farm, because they slaughtered horses for mink food. Mink was the big thing to raise at the time,
Yeah.
And mink could not eat beef. It made them sick. It wasn't rich enough, but they could live on horse meat. So the mink farm was right in the middle of Mennonite country. Lots of horses.
So when the horses got old or
Yeah.
sick,
The people didn't want them anymore, they'd sell them to the mink farm. You bought them by the pound, or they sold them by the pound. And we got, for the first 10 years, I think we got most of our horses from the mink farm. They were good riding horses. We'd try them, and
so you got them so they didn't get slaughtered.
right,
So they would sell them as well as kill them.
right. They'd sell them by the pound. So you found a horse that you liked, that you thought would work for you and work out, and you'd ride them, make sure that they were rideable and that they didn't have any bad habits, and then put them on a scale and pay for them.
What'd you do with them at the end of the year?
We kept them. We kept our horses all year round.
You kept them up here even though you were in San Diego?
Right. We used to keep them down at Cassines, which was down you know where Cassines is.
Down off of
Yeah.
Island Lake Road.
Yep.
And
And
that's Bob Cassine?
no, it was Hank, I think. That would probably be his father.
His father.
Or his
Okay.
grandfather. Because at the time, I can remember that I wasn't all that amazed, because, and I found out later why, but they'd had no indoor plumbing. And they had a big old barn. We used to buy hay from them too. But I remember that they had a hand pump in the kitchen. And it didn't surprise me, because I think my mother's sister also had a hand pump in the kitchen in Texas. But I found out when I was going to college that after World War II, less than 50% of the homes in this country, in the United States, had indoor plumbing.
I know, we were kind of like, didn't know we were really fortunate.
Yeah,
Huh?
I know, we didn't.
I know. I mean,
Because we lived in newer homes. Everybody else, if you lived out on the ranch or if you lived on the farm.
or you lived in Mississippi or
Yeah.
Tennessee or whatever.
Well, no, if you lived in the older parts of town, or of the country, older settled parts, their houses were built 100 years before, 200 years before. They didn't have any indoor plumbing.
yeah.
And they'd been updated as the population grew because of the sanitation issues. But it's when we were young, or I'm a couple
Same.
years older than you,
Just
maybe.
1 year.
Okay. When we were younger, it wasn't a big deal,
Right.
because we knew too many people that didn't have indoor plumbing.
Right. Right. So now tell me about the Cassines. Do they take good care of your horses?
They took good care. Towards the later years, it was a little scary, because hunters would go in and they would spot. And we were scared to death they were going to kill one of our horses. They didn't get one of our horses, but they did. Bow hunters shot one of Cassine's workhorses. If you can imagine, spotting at night, they had to have been drinking, because this
they were spotlighting at night.
spotlighting, yes, with their spotlights on their cars, and then they were hunting by spotlight.
Illegally. yeah.
Definitely, because it was private property also.
Right.
And they shot one of Cassine's horses, workhorses, draft horses, and they're huge. I mean, they were bigger than our horses. Our horses look more like deer than Cassine's draft horses. And then we started keeping them up at in Butternut.
Oh, that's a long ways away.
45 miles. And we would have a ride. After Labor Day, we would take all the horses and we would ride them up. And that was fine for all of us kids and that hung around the stables, because we were used to riding. 1 year, Harry Kazmarek and I don't think they were married yet. I think they were dating. And they decided they were going to go. He said, "You're sitting down. How hard can this be?" Well, he actually discovered that there was a lot more to riding than he knew. And his muscles told him the day after, riding 45 miles,
He was
on
a
a horse.
sore, huh? Well, you know, I interviewed Harry, and he had really fond memories of going over to Cassines on a Sunday and renting horses and riding up here in the winter.
Oh,
so
well,
they must have been your horses.
They were our horses, yes, and we didn't know that he was doing that. That's fine, you know, as long as the horses are treated well,
Yeah.
and fed well.
He talked about himself and Skip,
Oh,
and I think it was Bakken, Ricky,
it could be Ricky.
and they would ride.
Yeah.
And he said there was absolutely nobody on the highways, you know, at that time of year. And
Oh yeah, I remember the one year. My cousin Delmer was driving a team or one horse with our buckboard, and he had two horses tied on the back, going down the road. At that time, we all had mailboxes on the highway, and one horse went the opposite around,
Oh.
and he looked back, and it was just like somebody was sewing them off. These mailboxes flying up in the air as the horse's lead went right underneath it. We had to go back and replace mailboxes.
oh, that's funny.
What else? We did a lot of things. You know, it's like when I was a teenager, I had this old blue Ford, 54 Ford pickup. I think top speed was like 45 miles an hour. You probably remember that one.
Right.
And I only drove it in town, around the township, because my mother wouldn't let me drive it anyplace else. And it was just transportation and used for hauling sawdust or hay or whatever. And, you know, we see kids on the truck. We called it the Mustang because the key that came with it had a Mustang insignia on it, the keychain. By that point, my cousins were no longer coming up, but we had Jack Feiereisen. And Jackie worked for us for several years. I did skip around. Two of our earlier...
So he would do the tours? Or do
Yeah,
the...
he would work at the stables. He worked at the stables. That was when your brother Roger... They told a story about Jack and not Roger, but Judy and Kathy Rice. Jeff
Cole.
Jeff
No, Jeff.
That was
Jeff Rice.
Jeff Rice, but this was Jack and Henry Voss and Kathy's brother.
Oh, Jim Osborne.
Jim Osborne. They all went to Cassines to get hay, and Jackie and Jim. It's summer, and there's nothing more. Well, the only thing more miserable than I don't think actually there is nothing more miserable than handling hay in the middle of summer because it is so hot and so prickly, and you're in a hot barn, and they couldn't find Henry. After about 15 minutes, Henry had disappeared, and it was just Jackie and Jim Osborne loading the truck to bring the hay back to the stables. And Henry decided that was too much work, and he wasn't going to do that.
He disappeared.
Yes. Oh, and then there was the day that my father had borrowed a flatbed from McFarland's. It was a I don't know, early 50s pickup, or no, it wasn't a pickup, it was a 1-ton truck that had a flat bed on it. And my dad was going to haul hay, and he and I loaded hay from Wysocki's. And we're going down the road.
Where was Wysocki's?
Wysocki's was on Highway W, just past the Oasis. It's now Smokies.
Okay. On Highway W, and it was a farm?
Mm-hmm.
Wonder if that was one of those potato farms.
It was. My father said those potatoes were the best potatoes he ever ate. He swore that Wysocki put sugar in the soil. They were so sweet.
Huh.
And Mr. Wysocki was the only person I've ever seen eating peas with a knife. I still remember that. My eyes must have been as big as saucers when I saw him eating peas with a knife.
Wow. Wow.
But my dad and I was a teenager then, so I must have been 16, 17, driving that truck of McFarland's
Full of hay.
full of hay back to the stables. We got to the stables and my dad said, "Okay, back me in." And I hopped out of the truck and I looked and there was no hay on the truck. And the bed had lifted. And we had dumped probably a ton of hay on the highway someplace. So we turned around. He's going, "What are you laughing at?" And I said, "We don't have any hay." And he goes, "It's not so damn funny." We got in the truck. We headed back up 51 towards town, and we got right to the feather factory. And all of our hay was stacked on both sides of the highway. Somebody at the feather factory had seen what had happened, and there was hay all over 51, baled hay. So, and they all came out and they piled it. They moved it and stacked it on both sides of the highway. Oh
my gosh! So you got it all back.
We got it all back, but we had to load it twice, and then it could have been very serious.
Oh yeah.
But that's when Manitowish Waters was a small town and everybody knew everybody.
Yeah, that was nice of them.
Yes.
So did your horses ever get out on you?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Mrs. Tenney's, and the Tenneys are no longer here. They have passed on. But
where did they live?
They lived on the opposite side of Bart's fields. Right across, Mrs. Bart's house is right across from the library, and Tenney's house was the next one south of it. So it's like right there.
Was it T-E-N?
T-E-N-N-I-S, I believe.
Like tennis.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And we would get calls saying that the horses were out and come get them. And sometimes they would be on the airport and sometimes not. Our first trail that we had was around the airport runways, the first trails. Mm-hmm. And it just got to be too dangerous taking the horses across 51 as time went and more people were driving up here and there were less means of transportation other than cars. So we built we made another trail that ran along the channel and behind Little Bohemia, behind the tackle box.
How'd you get to Little Bohemia? That's across the highway.
No, opposite side of the highway. Because Little Bohemia, right. Emil owned that property.
Okay, yeah.
Emil Winnetka Sr. used to come over and pick up horse manure. He'd load his pickup up from our manure pile and fertilize his lawns with the horse manure from the stables. Said it was the best fertilizer there was. And that's why their grass always looks so good out there.
Yeah. It was from the flying pea.
Yeah, flying pea, yes. Let's see.
Okay, so you changed your route to behind, but what about the horses? The horses cross the highway.
No, they wouldn't cross. They didn't cross the highway after that because most of the horses that we had when we were using the airport trails, we no longer had. They
didn't remember that trail.
Well, no, they passed on. Oh. You know, horses don't live as long as people.
So when they passed on, did you take them back to the mink farm?
No,
you buried them.
Yeah, they didn't take dead animals, dead horses. They'd get buried.
Did the county bury them for you?
No, the farmers buried them. Or they got left out. I really don't know because we only lost two that I remember during the summer. One broke her leg, and John McFarland came with equipment and dug a hole. Actually, for both of the horses. The other one got pneumonia and died.
That has to be rough memories.
Yes. Well, the memories of the one that died, we buried him in the ring, and because it was sandy and it was clear, and we didn't really bury him deep enough.
Oh my God. That's
And I think I was about 19. And so I was running the stables at the time. and I had my sister and her girlfriend Cindy from San Diego were up, and they went out, and the way John had just dug a trench and then pulled the body of the horse in, and it landed on his back with his feet up, and it wasn't deep enough. And some animal had gotten to the carcass during the night and dug up 1 foot. So there was 1 foot sticking out, and Cindy saw it. And these girls were, well, if I was 19, they were like 14, 13, I guess. Oh, the screams. Oh, Blaze. Oh, it's Blaze. Oh, yes. But we always had kids at the stables.
Well, I know my sister, Candy was really into the stables. Yeah.
Candy was a big help. And my mother's philosophy was, if they want to hang around, they have to work. And there were a lot of kids that grew up at our stables with a work ethic that they wouldn't have gotten anyplace else. And when you have livestock, you have to work 7 days a week. So, and let's see, back to horses getting out. I remember one time when some people called about us riding on their driveway. And it was a trail that we had, and along the river, or the channel, and they built houses there, and one particular person didn't like the horses, except that his driveway had been a logging trail that had been our trail first. And the state had given us permission to ride on, because it was state land. He had without an easement, he had made a driveway across state land. Oh. But he called Masadi to come and throw us in jail.
Tell us about Masadi.
Oh, Masadi was the town policeman. I don't know how to spell Masadi's name.
Town police. Mm-hmm. Who was this other gentleman?
I don't remember his name. And I don't really care to remember his name. It wasn't Helds. Helds were there first.
Oh, Susie Held.
Yeah. It wasn't them. Because the Helds were related to somebody that we had working for us one summer. And I don't remember who that was. But I remember that they were related. So, that was sort of family. But, yeah, that was...
So they complained about the horses. What did Masadi do?
He laughed a lot. He told them that we were there before they were.
Good.
But he came and picked me up, and I went and I showed him where they were complaining about, and I told him, it was state land, and it wasn't, it wasn't a paved road. It was just sand.
So they're not hurting you.
And it wasn't his personal one. Everybody that had moved down there had use of that road.
Yeah. How about did wild animals ever bother the stable?
Only once, when I was very young, we had a horse die, and underneath a big huge white pine that we had, and my dad, I don't remember it, but my dad told the story about a bobcat sat over that tree, over that horse, and howled all night, or whatever bobcats do, squall or squeal, but they never bothered them. I used to ride down back behind the airport, the community church, that road, the Marathon Road.
Yeah.
And I saw bear when I was riding, and we used to see deer a lot. We would have, we were the equestrian part of Camp Jorn's program.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's a good thing to...
Yeah, when Camp Jordan was from Waukegan, so they had all these city kids that had never seen any wildlife. So we'd take them on the trail, and you would think, they had never seen deer. And because we had horses, the horses' smell sort of covered the human smell. And the deer were used to seeing us, and they would just stand and watch us most of the time as we would ride by, until the kids would go, oh, what's that? What's that? It's a deer. It's a deer. Because they hadn't a clue. I can still sing the Camp Jordan song.
So how many days a week did Camp Jordan ride?
When I don't remember how they had it set up. A lot of times it was about 3 times a week. And they'd get enough kids that would take all the horses. So I usually had to take them out because my horse wasn't, at that point, the horse that I had was not suitable for non-riders. You need to be a more experienced rider to ride him.
So did you take the horses to camp, or did the camp come to you?
No, the camp came to us. It was much easier than hauling 14 horses or 17 horses.
Yeah.
And so we had Camp Jordan would come during the summer, every summer. And
Do you know what years that might have been? In the 40s?
no,
50s,
that would have been in the
60s?
60s, the late 50s and the 60s. I know it was in the 60s. What else? Oh, so many anecdotes. I remember one time running into Cal Laporte, and he was talking about me being a native, and I said, I'm not a native. And he looks at me and he says, no, but you've been here longer than most of the people that live here, so you're a native.
That was a compliment.
Yes. Well, we had. I mean, everybody, when we first moved here, there was only like 300 population. It was small.
Did your parents ever think about living here permanently, or?
My dad always wanted to, but my mother didn't. She didn't like cold weather. And no. I was just thinking about it yesterday, that my parents must have been in their 30s when they moved here. I never thought of my parents as being 30, you know?
And so as far as the airport, so you think your dad ran the airport?
Yeah, he ran the airport. I can remember him telling stories about, or somebody, I guess it was him, telling stories. There was a woman that flew up here from Texas, and she had, I think it's Ahern's place now. Mrs. Gibbs, I think it was Mrs. Gibson. And the prop on her plane was bent. And my father didn't have any tools that could fit, or any replacement parts for it. So he actually straightened the prop for her plane between 2 birch trees, Veed birch trees. My father was resourceful. He came from a place where you had to fix your own things.
Yeah.
You didn't have stores to go buy them, or you didn't have the resources to buy them.
Yeah, that's sometimes the best thing.
Yeah.
Other stories about the airport?
Oh, one time we had a couple of horses we just bought new. They got away from us. They got out and they crossed the road and they ended up in the swamp over on the south side of the airport between Powell Road and the runway. There's a big swamp back there. And we looked and we looked. And we found one of them. We found one of them right away. And the other one, we
They could die in
yeah,
that, could they?
she was stuck in the swamp. And we had 2 cowboys working for us at the time. I think it was when the cowboys were there. And they roped her and pulled her out.
So she was up to how far in her?
I don't know.
But she was in the muck.
She was in the muck and couldn't get out. And they hauled her out with a couple of other horses. That year, was I 10? I think I was 10, so it must have been 57, 58. We lived in San Antonio that year in the winter. We hired 2 cowboys, Red and Rock.
Do we know their last names?
I don't remember what Rock's last name was, but Red's was Yancey, Yancy.
And they were cowboys. Red and
And
Rock.
Rock had been a rodeo cowboy, been injured, and ex-Marine in the war.
World War II.
Yes. And so I learned an awful lot, but my father still didn't know horseflesh very well, and he went down to the auction in, forgot where. He went to a horse auction, and we ended up with, I think they bought 22 head of horses, and half of them weren't broke. And these guys convinced my dad that they were rideable. And my father didn't know. And at that point, we put them, my mother had purchased property, a farm, at the end of Powell Road. It's the old Sherman farm.
The end of Powell Road, all the way out to 47?
Yep. It was on 47
And
and
there's
Powell
a
Road.
big pasture there, yeah.
Yeah, and
Sherman Farm.
it was the first beef ranch in the North Woods. They had a barn that had been built. I remember that barn. It was made of huge, huge timbers, and it was all hand hewn, and it was all put together with pegs. And it was starting to fall down. My mother bought it for back taxes in Iron County. She was wise enough to log off enough timber to pay for it. And she eventually sold it back to the state. And so part of it was that, the bridge where 182 comes into 47, that swamp that's across the street, or across 47 and south the Powell Road, that was the area.
Really?
It's about 80 acres, I think. For some reason, I think that.
Okay.
I don't have any idea
And that's
why.
where you kept the horses too?
That's where we kept all of the horses when he bought them at the ranch, or at the auction, because we didn't want to bring horses that had been shipped, and we wanted to
Make sure they were okay.
quarantine them before we mixed them in with the rest of our herd, which was healthy.
So whatever happened to the unbroke horses?
Well, some of them never did get broken. I can remember we had one that never did get broken.
What was her name?
Cherry.
Cherry.
And Rock loved that horse. And he tried to make a riding horse out of her, and she must have come out of a bucking string someplace because you never could ride her. I think she probably got sold back to the mink farm. And
So did he buy these 22 to kind of keep?
yeah, well, we thought we needed them. So our string was up to about 25 horses. That was the most horses we ever had. We usually ran anywhere from 15 to 18.
Okay.
And of course, 2 of the horses that they bought were stallions. So the next year, we had a lot of babies. My mother was so mad at those cowboys. And that brings up our vet. Our vet was from Hurley. Ironwood?
What was
Ironwood. His name was Doc Eddy.
his? Doc Eddy.
Yes. And Doc Eddy had put himself through veterinary school as a sparring partner for Gorgeous George, the wrestler. I'm serious. He was.
What was Eddie? Was Eddie's that his last name?
Eddie, yes.
Professor Eddie.
Eddy, Eddie. He was gorgeous. That's how he got him. He paid for his vet school. He was the nicest man. And every time he'd come, he'd bring my sister and I each a bag of licorice candy.
Aw.
And we hated licorice.
Oh, but
My mother had a 4-drawer file cabinet, and one whole drawer was filled with bags of licorice candy.
she didn't want you to be rude and say, "Could you bring?"
Yeah.
some?"
Quit bringing. We've got plenty. He was quite the character.
And he was a good vet.
He was a good vet, yes. He was about as wide as he was tall at that point. And he couldn't do a lot of bending over anymore because he was a little rotund and it cut off his breath. And so he would have all of us kids or whoever we had working for us holding the horses to do when he did procedures on them. And I won't go into when we gelded some colts. That's a whole different story, which is probably not appropriate for this venue. But he would drive into our driveway, and he would hit a tree, and he'd laugh, and he'd back up, trying to turn his car around, and he'd hit another tree, and he'd laugh, and he'd move his car around. He was a character. But he was the nicest man. My mother had psoriasis on one of her hands, on her arm. And he brought her some stuff down that took care of it immediately. I mean, it worked within a week. She had no problems at all. And a couple of years later, there was something on the market, and it was really big at the time. And it was the same stuff. It smelled exactly the same as what Doc Eddie had mixed up.
From the animal stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you had lots of...
We had a lot of kids. We had groups. They would come in age groups. So you'd get a whole group of 15, 16-year, or actually they were usually before they could drive. So that would be 14, 15, or even 13, 14, and 15-year-olds.
That would meet at the...
That would be at stables and hang out at the stables. And because there were girls there, my sister and her girlfriends from California, we had a lot of boys.
So it was kind of a real social...
It was a
center
social thing, yes.
For teenagers.
My mom always made sure we had stuff to eat for lunch, and we had a Coke machine, which I have never, ever seen another one like it. It was a little bit smaller than this table, and it was round like this table. And you had to look down into the window, and you would turn a knob on the top of it. And I don't know where my dad got it, but I've never seen another Coke
Where is
machine.
it?
I don't know. I don't know what happened to it. I think when we sold the horse, I don't know what happened to it.
What year did you stop doing the horses?
Let me think. I had left home, and I wasn't coming up here anymore, and my sister had no interest, and my mother just couldn't do it by herself. So it must have been when I was 21, so that would have been 69, 70.
You know, it sounds like your horse ranch made quite an impact on the community.
It did, especially the summer kids, because the winter kids had jobs all year round. But the summer kids, that was back in the day when the summer kids, even though their parents had summer homes up here and they were fairly well-to-do, they still needed to earn, they still wanted to have jobs, or their parents encouraged them to work. And so we hired kids later on, teenagers.
Who were some of the other people that worked where you...
Jackie and Jeff and Stone Cipher. Carl Stone Cipher.
Carl Stone Cipher, okay.
Stoney. I think his name was Carl. We called him Stoney. He worked for us for a couple of years. And
He was from Wauwatosa, too.
yes. Well, there was Fire Risings, Ruth Ann Palin, who she worked for us. There was somebody from Dick. He was from north of Milwaukee. He was from a farm. His name was Dick. I don't remember his last name. No, that was before. That was the original Skeeters, the Tom Fire Racing era, before your brother's era. And no, he didn't. He was a farm boy. It was just continually.
Yeah.
And
what about your dad? Did he come every summer?
no, he didn't. Later on,
Because I don't remember your dad much.
well, what happened was that the company he worked for, it was a factory, and he would quit every June.
So you could spend...
So he could spend the summer up here, and then he would go back and ask him to, or they would rehire him every fall or every winter, And finally they said, enough of this. You stay or don't come back at all.
Okay.
So he would come up on his vacation days and then fly home, leaving my mother and I and my sister up here to run everything. My mother ran the resort, and I ran the stables from the time I was probably 15.
Mm-hmm. So how about the resort? Was that a real productive?
Not too much. We only had 2 cabins, but we had a 10-bedroom lodge. And she sold property she sold the 2 cabins, one at a time, and then she sold the lodge. I think Willie Byram rented it 1 year.
I remember
and
Willie saying that he and Joni lived there 1 year.
Yes, they were going to have a bed and breakfast, but it didn't work out.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the name of your lodge again?
Flying P. I do remember I found some old calendars that my parents kept when we first started the stables, and they would write down what they took in for income for the day every day and what the weather was like. And it rained. One of the first summers we were up here, it rained almost every day. So when people talk about how much rain we've had this year, back then we had a lot of rain. That was 60, 70 years ago, 65 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I remember my mom and your mom and
Oh, your mom and my mom were good buddies.
They were.
I remember a story about your mom.
okay.
She went to Woodruff.
This is Betty Christensen.
Yes, this is Betty Christensen. She took her car down to, I don't know whether it was Woodruff or Minocqua, to get it serviced. And I don't know whether it was Buick. Did you have Buicks?
We did, yeah.
I think it was the dealership. And when she was down there, this guy came in and brought his car in, dropped it off, and left. Well, your mother was very impressed, and she came. I was with my mom when your mother came in and said, "Oh, you will never guess who I saw at the car dealership." Oh, she was going on, and it was a very famous actor. And I cannot, for the life of me, remember who it was. But they were like 2 16-year-old schoolgirls with crushes, both of them. I'm just crying. And of course, I must have been maybe 14, 15. And I was just cracking up because they looked so silly. And they were just, oh, yes. And it was like Robert, I want to say Robert somebody or another. If I saw him on TV, I would know.
Which one it was.
Which one it was. He was an A-lister. He was an A-lister. And he had a cabin or a house around Minocqua. And I will never forget that. Your mom was so great.
Yeah, you lived with my mom.
Yes,
for a
I
year.
lived your
How
mom.
old? Well, I must have been in college.
Yeah, I was 21. So
Yeah, so I was at Stevens Point then.
yes, I lived with your mother and your sister.
And you worked at
Chappie's. I was the only female employee in 3 sporting goods stores. I worked in the office, and when they needed somebody out front, I worked out front. I knew nothing about guns or golf. And if people bought golf clubs, they should have checked, because a lot of them had little nicks on the bottom where I was practicing and hitting the tile floor. But, yeah, we had, that was, and it was so cold because it wasn't heated in the office. It was just a cement block. And this is in Milwaukee.
Okay.
And it was
Yeah.
interesting.
And how old were you when
I
you
was
were?
21. I turned 21 the year I moved out of the house. I left home.
And then you ended up in Minnesota for your career?
Yes. In 1980. I worked for a company called Control Data in La Jolla, California. And La Jolla was closing, or Control Data was closing the La Jolla facility. And it was like we had a lot. Control Data sold the property. And property in La Jolla is very expensive. Mm-hmm. And we had, our Control Data had 2 softball fields that they rented to the girls' softball team for $20 a year. And right now there is a huge shopping center on those two softball fields. But they closed the facility and they gave many of us a chance to transfer to the home offices, which were in Minneapolis.
Mm. So that's how you.
That's how I got back to Minneapolis, St.
Your
Paul.
house, what was? I remember your town was a different name. It was
I live in Arden Hills,
Arden Hills,
which is a
California.
where I live,
Oh no, I mean when you lived in California, what was the name?
Chula Vista.
Chula Vista. Yeah, Chula Vista. I always remember that address for some reason.
Beautiful view. There's a Chula Vista, someplace off of Highway 94 going south, resort. And every time I see it, I go, "You're in the wrong place." Why do you have a Spanish name for your place?
Now,
when
have
you're
you
in...
sold all your parents' things?
No,
are you
I
out?
still. Their property was left between my sister and myself, except my sister had predeceased her niece, so it went to my niece and myself. Mm-hmm. And my niece was too young to be able to put her name on property, so it's an LLC, and the property's in there. Everything. My parents have a duplex. I have a duplex out there in their name, or in the LLC, and I've got the place up here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you still have a little bit of California.
Oh yes, oh yes. I still go out there. I have friends that I graduated from high school with, and we get together. We haven't because their husbands have been ill, so haven't been able to travel any lately. But we used to get together every year, and I make all of the high school functions, which is fun because I worked for Northwest Airlines before it became Delta, and I could fly home. That was one reason I went to work for Northwest, was because of the flying privileges. That way I could fly out to see my mother.
Yeah. Now, when did your mother pass away?
I want to say 98.
Okay. 1998.
Mm-hmm.
And when did she stop coming up north?
Oh, 95. Before my dad died. When my dad died, she didn't come back.
Okay. So your dad died in 90?
He died in 96.
96. So they were still living when Tony passed away?
Yes.
That must have been hard.
Oh, it was very hard. And when my sister passed away was Christmas time.
Oh.
And we didn't know at the time, but they don't bury people in the ground up here in the winter. And my sister passed away from breast cancer, and she was 34. And her friends got together, and they built a fire over on where we were going to bury her, where our plots were. And they built a fire, thawed the ground, and we buried her the day before Christmas Eve in 1990. 90?
So did Tony end up living here?
Tony lived here from the time she was 18. She lived in that cabin that they
little
built.
Cabin by the road?
Yep. It's tongue and groove cedar, no insulation. It's just tongue and groove cedar on a cement slab, and with
That floor was cold.
They did put a rug in there, carpet, and she lived there for most of her adult life until she was in a very serious car accident in Ironwood.
I don't know if I remember that.
Oh,
either.
she almost died. She was going home. A guy was driving, and he was too drunk to be on the road, and she was his passenger. And he hit a tree, and He was not killed, but she was thrown out of the vehicle, and they found her behind the back wheels. They don't know how she got there, of the truck. She had head injuries, and she had some other injuries, and they weren't sure whether she was going to live or not. But she did, and after she had met her husband-to-be before then, and they got married after that.
Mm-hmm.
And she lived in Prior Lake? No, that's Wisconsin. That's Minnesota. Down out by Holy Hill,
Okay.
and there that's where she lived until she passed on.
Okay. But having a sister that much younger was probably like almost being two single
Oh yeah,
children.
yes. No, I
Or
got to be the
aunt.
babysitter.
Yeah.
I got to be the babysitter growing up, so we had nothing in common, personality wise, or friends or anything, because we were so different in ages. Now, her age group were pretty wild and woolly. They used to short out the fences at night after we'd turn the horses out and go in and ride the horses. And that was one reason why our horses got out, because they'd get to running them at night, and they'd run the horses through the fences.
Oh.
My mother caught them one evening, and she walked, which I don't know how, if somebody called or what happened, but she caught them trying to short the fence out.
And I always remember wearing a cowboy outfit.
Yeah, she had a Western shirt.
Yeah, Western shirt. She wore a hat. She had a big belt. I remember, in jeans. Yeah, she always looked the part of a
Yeah.
very nice
lovely.
lady.
I
Very nice lady.
I still have a couple of her pieces of clothing. I've got a pair of real gold lame wedgie sandals from the 1940s. My feet are too big. I'm bigger than my mother. But I still got that, and a rayon blouse. That was back when rayon was brand
Yeah, I
new.
remember that.
And I got a couple of her Western shirts, too, and a suede vest, which I will never get into again.
You ride anymore?
No, the last time I went riding, I didn't have a problem getting on because I was at a friend's house, and she had problems getting on, so her husband had built her like a little bleacher steps that she could get her horse next to and get on. So I got on, but after we rode for an hour, I had trouble getting off. I couldn't swing my leg over the back of the horse. So I haven't been riding. I have been, I have friends in the carriage driving
Oh.
sport. In fact, next weekend is one of the biggest carriage driving events in the Midwest, and it's down at Villa Louis.
Oh, that would
which
be
is
beautiful.
It
to see.
is gorgeous, and they get teams from all over the country that come in there, and anything from single horses to 4-horse teams.
Now, did you keep a horse for
In California, no, I didn't have horses in California.
just up here in the summer?
Just up here in the summer.
And what about as an adult? Did you keep a horse once you left the stables?
No.
No.
Well, yes, I did. I take that back. When I moved to Minnesota, I could afford it. I couldn't afford to have a horse out
Horses
in California.
Jeff, we had horses in Mrs. Jeff grew up with horses.
Okay.
And he always said, if you want a money hole, have horses. Because they're so expensive to keep.
Well,
They need a lot of attention and good
Yeah.
food. And
they do. And it's, if you have horses, it's because you love horses. It's because they aren't resilient like cattle or goats or sheep. They've got a very touchy digestive tract, and they don't have multiple stomachs, so they get what's called colic, and they, just like that, they're gone.
kill them.
And they can twist a gut just rolling. And I started out with a roommate, or I was sharing a place with a gal who was her place. She had horses. She didn't know much about them, and I did save her from making some really bad buys. You don't want to buy that horse? Oh, but she's so sweet. I said, yes, and she's lame. You don't want to buy a lame horse.
So if you had to wrap it up, what would you say about that childhood in Manitowish Waters and that experience?
We were talking last night, Barb Zaleski, Cartland, and Mary Beth Kolarczyk and I. And, it's all of us grew up here summers. Barb Zaleski was the only person that I have ever known that could come to the stables wearing white tennis shoes and a white blouse and go home with white tennis shoes and a white blouse. Although I was filthy by the time I was there for half an hour. Everybody else was too, and we smelled like horses, but not Barb. And she worked, but she never got dirty. And all of us agreed we would not trade our childhoods for anything. We had the best childhood you can imagine.
And tell us that. Tell us why. What the combination was.
Well, we had horses and we had trees, and our parents gave us responsibilities and expected from us a lot. And we lived up to that, or we tried to. And we had freedom. We could run, we could swim, we could ski. I was in the skiing skeeters. I didn't do much because I was always working, but I was one of the first junior members. I was a non-skiing member. Skied in one show.
But that was an important part of the show.
It's-
I mean, no, and just the chance to learn to ski better with other skiers and just the camaraderie.
You might have been in that same show. It was the ballet. And it was, who was it? You, I think it was you and me and Ricky maybe and Linda Miller.
Lori?
Could have been Lori. It was just, like 4 of us fell. But we had a good time. And our parents always came.
Yeah.
And there was much more a sense of community then. Mm-hmm. We didn't have electronics.
Right.
We didn't stay inside. TV was non-existent up here at the time. Reception was zip.
The only radio station you got was Ironwood, and at night WLS in Chicago.
Yeah.
So you could hear the rock and roll at night.
Well, we had an old Philco radio. I still have it, but my brother-in-law's significant other poured water all over it, watering her plants. Mm. So all the veneer stripped off of it. But that radio was in the lodge, and it we could pull in really weird stations at night, like Pennsylvania and Canada. We'd get a lot of Canadian stations, but you never knew where you were, where they were coming from. A lot of that had to do with the iron ore. It affected the radio waves.
Oh.
That's what my dad said anyway.
Yeah, I've heard, that the magnetic, there is some sort of magnetic situation going on up further north.
But, yeah, when we had the lodge and we'd all go out at night, my mom would come home, or she'd come up the next morning when I was still asleep, she'd go, Darla, who's on the couch? And I go, blonde or brunette, male or female? Oh, it must be so-and-so. Because if somebody didn't have a place to stay, we put them up. And my mother went through, I don't know how many generations. At her memorial service here, there was three generations of adults that had grown up at the stables.
That is so cool, isn't it?
Yep. I remember Johnny Gibson, his parents owned the Circle Lily, cabins over on Circle Lily. They were the only ones on Circle Lily at the time. And he had shot a bear that was on one of the cabin's doorsteps. And so the guests couldn't get in, so Johnny shot it. And he skinned it, and we hung it on this, and they dried the skin on the side of our shed over there, the place we were living in. And I had bear meat. I can remember looking at that bear meat, and it looked like it was a steak that was this big, but, I was little then, so it was probably only this big. Yeah. And it was round. It looked like a log, actually, piece of wood, because it was so red and it had rings.
Really?
Yeah, that
Wings
was-
of fat, maybe, huh?
No, I don't know what it was, but that's all I remember. I couldn't have been more than 5, so I don't remember a whole lot. But I do remember that, and fishing for sunfish down at Bart's when I was little. Oh, Judy Nisty and I, that was their granddaughters, Judy and Linda Nisty. Judy and I burnt down one of her her grandfather's outhouses at the cabins, playing with matches. He never did know who did it.
Oh my gosh.
We were lighting matches and throwing them down the back of the outhouses. We thought they were out, we'd throw them down. And
Yeah.
apparently one of them wasn't, and all that methane gas just...
It's a little science lesson, huh?
Yeah, well, yes. My mother knew. I don't know. I could never lie. So I told my mother, and I don't know if she told Jim or not, Jim Bart. I remember Mrs. Bart cooking at the school.
And the Barts had the property you bought plus, right?
They owned everything from this road here that goes down to Joseph's, all the way over this whole bay. Oh, my nose is...
Do you need a cleaner?
No, I've got one. But, and the 2 fields out here, Mitchell Road, that was their driveway.
I don't remember.
And the
that
cabins. No, you probably wouldn't. Jim was Mary Beth Kolarchik's uncle.
Oh, okay.
And Emil Winnetka. I've got a menu from Little Bohemia from 1950 something.
Oh, that'd be neat to get a copy of. for
Well,
the Historical
I've got it.
Society. Digitized?
No, I have it mounted
Oh. A menu from Little Bo in 1957.
Oh, yeah.
with a Emil Senior wrote on it. It was to my mom. Best wishes or something else.
Mm-hmm.
But steak and lobster was $3.50. That's the best. Everybody's just amazed at when they look at the prices,
Yeah.
and that was pretty pricey then.
Right.
I mean,
Do you have other pictures? Would you have any pictures that we can scan? I mean, we wouldn't keep originals, but anything that of you and your horses or anything?
I have
like
very
that?
little. If anything, it's out in California, in the storage out there. I don't have any of that here. I might have a picture of myself and a horse, but as far as the other horses, I was telling Casey that my dad had a 8mm camera, but he really wasn't good at taking pictures because he would sit holding the camera and the motion of the horse meant the camera was moving too, so it's very choppy looking. Oh, I didn't tell you about the moonlight rides. We used to have moonlight rides.
Yeah, I remember those.
Oh my gosh.
And we would go to Little Star Beach and, well, first of all, we used to have them over at a sand pit that's between Benji's house and the airport. You know, he had his own little landing strip. Well, right off of that is like a sand pit, and we used to have them there, our first ones. And when we stopped riding across the street around the airport, then we started going to Little Star, and we would ride. It didn't have to have a moon, but we would ride in the pitch dark and in the woods, and thank God the horses knew where they were going. And we would stop and we would roast marshmallows and hot dogs and sit around and sing songs and then get on the horses and ride back. So some days you started at 7 in the morning and you got through at midnight.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really cool. You know, when I talked to Jody and she said, about the airport, I thought, wow, the stables. Gosh.
Yeah, the stables. The airport, but not too many people go back as far as the airport anymore.
Yeah.
Because my father would be
Any other airport stories that you can remember?
no.
How old would your father be now? Your mother must have been.
My mother would have been, or my dad would have been in his 90s. My mother was born in 1920.
Oh, so she was a year younger than my mom.
And my dad was born in, oh, I am so bad with dates. I want to say 1918, but I don't think so. I think it was 1914.
Okay.
Somewhere between 14 and 18.
Yeah.
And he would have been over 100.
103. Yeah, well, this has really been great. I wonder if next time you go to California, if you could look for some pictures, because this would be a great place to.
Well, every time I go, I go through the storage units and go, why am I keeping this? Get rid of this because I can't bear to get rid of stuff.
know, it's
Thinking
hard.
that, oh, maybe I'll move back out here and move into one of the places, or I don't have enough place to put anything. What I want to do is try and finish the basement off and then move it because it's mostly furniture now.
Mm-hmm.